I slammed my drink down on that picnic table so hard, the ice rattled, and every single person in that backyard went dead silent. My son had just looked me in the eyes in front of our entire family and said the 7 words no father should ever have to hear. And 10 minutes later, he called the police on me. Not because I hit him, not because I threatened him, because he believed something I built with my own 2 hands belonged to him. This is the story of the day I almost lost everything, and the decision that changed both of our lives forever. Drop a comment right now. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this hits home, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. I set that glass down so hard it cracked. Not because I was angry. Because my hands were shaking and I couldn't stop them. 65 years old. 32 years as a firefighter. I had walked into burning buildings. I had carried unconscious children down smoke-filled staircases. I had held the hands of people who were taking their last breath and told them it was going to be okay, even when I knew it wasn't. I had never, not once in 32 years, let anyone see me break. But standing in my own backyard on Father's Day, with the smell of barbecue in the air and people I had known for decades staring at their shoes, I felt something crack open inside my chest that no amount of training had ever prepared me for. My son Jason had just raised his glass. I thought he was going to make a toast. He looked at me the way you look at a stranger, and he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I wish you were never my dad." Nobody moved. My neighbor Carl, who had known me for 20 years, looked away toward the fence like he suddenly found the wood grain fascinating. My daughter-in-law Melissa went very still. Her eyes dropped to the table. My granddaughter Emma, who was 8 years old and had been trying to get me to taste her lemonade for the past 20 minutes, she just stopped smiling. Just like that. Like someone turned off a light. And me, I stood there with a plate of barbecue ribs in my hand. Ribs I had been cooking since 6 in the morning. Ribs from the same recipe my wife Margaret used to make before she got sick. Before she left us. Before it was just me and Jason, and I swore to God and to her memory that I would make sure our boy was okay. I set the plate down on the table. I set it down very carefully because my hands were not cooperating with me. And I looked at my son. He was 41 years old. He had his mother's eyes. He was wearing a polo shirt that probably cost more than my first week's salary at the fire station. And he was staring at me like he was waiting for me to crumble. Like he expected me to apologize. Like he expected me to say, "Jason, I'm sorry, please, whatever I did wrong, just tell me." I had done that before, more times than I want to admit. But not this time. I picked up my drink. I looked at him for a long moment, long enough that people started shifting their weight and clearing their throats. And I said quietly and clearly, "Then maybe it's time you learn how to live without everything your father built." I put the drink down. I walked through the backyard gate. I got in my truck, and I drove away. For about 3 miles, I didn't feel anything. That happens sometimes. I learned it in the fire service. When something is too big to process in the moment, your brain just goes quiet. You go into operational mode. You breathe. You focus on the road. You don't let yourself feel it yet, because if you feel it now, you won't be able to function. So I drove. I turned the radio on, then turned it off. I passed the old fire station on Route 12, where I spent the better part of my 40s. The lights were on inside. Some young crew I didn't recognize was washing one of the engines. I kept driving. And then somewhere around mile 5 it hit me. I had to pull over. I sat in that truck on the side of a road I had driven 1,000 times, and for the first time since Margaret's funeral, I put my head in my hands. Not because of what Jason said. Not exactly. But because somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice I didn't want to listen to was saying, "You knew. You saw this coming. And you let it happen anyway." Let me tell you something about the kind of father I thought I was. I thought I was the good kind. I thought I was the kind of father who showed up, who sacrificed, who did what needed to be done, even when it was hard, even when it cost me something. And by certain measures I was. I worked overtime every chance I got, so Jason could have new clothes for school and not feel embarrassed. I drove him to basketball practice at 5 in the morning because he wanted to make varsity. When he was 16 and got into a fist fight that almost got him expelled. I drove to that school and I sat across from that principal and I talked until they agreed to give him another chance. When Margaret got diagnosed, I took on a second job doing fire safety inspections, so her treatments were covered. And I still came home every night. I still sat at that kitchen table and helped Jason with his homework, even when I was running on 4 hours of sleep and my eyes didn't want to focus. And when she died, when we buried Margaret Bennett on a cold Tuesday in November, and the whole town came out, and I stood at that graveside in my dress uniform, because it was the only way I knew how to hold myself together. It was just me and Jason. He was 19. I remember he didn't cry at the funeral. Not in front of anyone. But that night, I heard him through the wall of his bedroom, and I just sat on the floor outside his door for an hour, because I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't run into that burning building and carry something out. I just sat there. And I told myself, I will not let this boy drown. Whatever it takes, I will not let him drown. That promise cost me more than I understood at the time. I paid for his college, all 4 years. He studied business, which wasn't what I would have chosen for him, but it was what he wanted, and I had promised Margaret I would support whatever direction he chose. He graduated. He had big ideas. That was always Jason, big ideas. Real confidence, the kind of energy that made people want to follow him. He was naturally magnetic in a way I never was. I was always the quiet type. The one who showed up and did the work while other people talked about it. Jason talked about it beautifully. His first business was a landscaping company. He came to me with a plan, spreadsheets, projections. He was 24 years old, and he sat across from me at this same kitchen table, and he laid it all out with the confidence of someone who had already succeeded. I said, "Son, what do you need?" He told me. I wrote the check. The business struggled in the second year. There were things Jason hadn't accounted for: employee costs, equipment maintenance, a contract that fell through. He came back to me embarrassed, and I could see it in his face, that mixture of shame and the fear that I was going to say, "I told you so." I didn't say that. I paid the debts. I told him every business has a learning curve. I told him the important thing was to figure out what went wrong and do better the next time. He nodded. He thanked me. He hugged me. And I thought, this is what fathers do. This is what it means to love someone. What I didn't realize, what I was too close to see, was that every time I stepped in and absorbed the consequences, I was teaching him something I never intended to teach him. I was teaching him that consequences weren't real. Not for him. Not when I was around. The second business did better. Event planning, corporate safety training. It grew slowly, and I was proud of him. He had a nice office, a couple of employees. He married Melissa, who was charming and smart and organized in ways that complemented Jason's big picture thinking. I liked Melissa at first. I want to be honest about that. I'm not going to rewrite history and tell you I always saw the problems, because I didn't. She was warm with me. She called me Dad. She brought food when she visited, and she always remembered things. I mentioned in passing that I preferred sweet tea over lemonade, that I didn't like the new version of some TV show I'd watched for years. Small things. Things that made me feel seen. But slowly, over months and then years, I started hearing things that made me uneasy. The first time was at a neighborhood gathering, some birthday party for someone on the street. I wasn't there. Carl told me about it later, a little awkwardly, the way people tell you something they're not sure you want to hear. He said Melissa had been talking about the lake cabin. She'd called it their cabin. "You know," she'd said to someone at the party, "Thomas built it up, but family property stays in the family. Jason's going to do so much with it eventually." When Carl told me that, I filed it away. I thought, she means well. She's just proud. People say things. Then I started hearing it from Jason directly. We'd be somewhere, a backyard cookout, a family dinner, and he'd mention the cabin, or my truck, or my business in a way that blurred the lines between mine and his. He'd say things like, "Well, when things pass down, eventually, I've been thinking about the renovations we'd make." Or he'd show somebody my vintage pickup truck and let them assume it was his without correcting them. The first few times I let it go. The second few times, I told myself he was just proud of the family legacy, that he wanted to feel connected to what I'd built. But there came a day, and I remember it clearly, because it was at his daughter Emma's birthday party, where I overheard him tell one of his friends, "Yeah, my dad's emergency training company. It'll come to me eventually. I've already got ideas for expansion." His friend said, "Man, that's a solid situation." And Jason said, "It is what it is. You work with what you've got." You work with what you've got, like he had worked for it, like it was already his. I stood in the hallway outside that room for a long moment. Then I walked in, handed Emma her birthday present, and smiled at everyone, and didn't say a word. That night alone, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. Why don't I say anything? And the answer, when it finally surfaced, was one I wasn't proud of. Because I'm afraid that if I push back, he'll pull away. And if he pulls away, I'll be alone. That was the truth. That was the thing I had never said out loud to anyone. I had buried Margaret. I had stood at that graveside in my dress uniform and held myself together through sheer will. And the one person left in the world who shared her eyes, who laughed at the same things she laughed at, who still sometimes put his hand on my shoulder the way she used to, I couldn't risk losing him. So I kept erasing the lines, and he kept moving them forward. The truck became the flashpoint. My 1967 Ford F-100, dark green. I spent 3 years restoring it after I retired. Every weekend in the garage. New engine, new interior kept the original bodywork because I wanted it to feel authentic. Margaret would have loved it. She always said classic trucks had character that modern cars never would. That truck was mine in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't had something like it. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was 3 years of Saturday mornings, and the smell of grease, and the sound of old country music on a portable radio. It was something I made with my hands during the years after the fire service, when I was still figuring out who Thomas Bennett was outside of a uniform. Jason started borrowing it for events. At first he asked. I said yes because he seemed genuinely excited about it, and it made him happy. Then the asking got more casual. "Hey, using the truck this weekend, not a question anymore, just an announcement." Then one weekend I needed it and couldn't find it. Called Jason and found out he'd taken it to a car show. A car show. Where he'd been letting people take pictures of it. I asked him as calmly as I could manage to please check with me before taking the truck. He said, "Dad, I figured you weren't using it. Relax." Relax. I let it go. I let it go because that's what I always did. And that pattern, years of letting it go, years of erasing the lines, is what made Father's Day possible. I spent 3 weeks planning that celebration. I want you to understand what that party was supposed to be. It wasn't about me wanting recognition. I was never that kind of man. I didn't need a standing ovation for doing what fathers are supposed to do. But I was 65 years old, and tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. And somewhere in the back of my heart, I had this quiet hope that maybe my son would look at everything I had given, everything I had sacrificed, and just acknowledge it. Not with a speech, not with a gift, just with his eyes, just with the way he looked at me, the way Emma looked at me when I pushed her on the swings, the way a person looks at you when they truly see you. I cooked since sunrise. Margaret's ribs recipe, the one I had to call her sister 3 times to get right because Margaret never wrote anything down. I set up the yard. I put up lights. I made everything as nice as I could. People started arriving around noon. Jason showed up at 1:30. I was already in a mood. I could see it the moment he walked through the gate. Something tight around his mouth. The way he hugged Emma too quickly, and then went straight for the cooler without saying hello to anyone. I gave him space. I thought he had a hard week, let him settle in. But the mood didn't lift. It sat over him like smoke. And as the afternoon went on, I could feel it spreading to the corners of the yard, the way smoke always does, quiet, invisible, until suddenly, you can't breathe. Around 3 o'clock I was at the grill when I heard him. He was talking to Carl's son Marcus near the fence, and he was talking about the training company. Honestly, the structure's a little outdated. When things come to me, the first thing I'm doing is restructuring the board. Marcus said something I couldn't hear. Jason said, "Well, my dad's not exactly thinking about these things anymore. That's kind of the point. You reach a certain age, you need someone else to take the wheel." I kept my eyes on the grill. I flipped a rack of ribs. I breathed. And then someone called for a toast, and Jason picked up his glass, and I turned around expecting— I don't know what I was expecting. Something kind. Something like what a son says to a father on Father's Day. He looked at me. The whole yard looked at me. And my son said, "I wish you were never my dad." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. 4 seconds that felt like 4 years. Emma said, "Grandpa," in a small voice. And that small voice almost undid me completely. But I did not let it. 32 years of holding it together in rooms full of heat and fear and chaos that training doesn't leave you. I put my drink down on the table. I looked at my son. I made sure my voice was level. And I said, "Then maybe it's time you learn how to live without everything your father built." I walked through the gate. I got in my truck. I drove. I was sitting on the side of that road, head in my hands, when the phone rang. Unknown number. Nashville area code. I answered. "Mr. Bennett, this is Officer Davies with the Nashville Police Department. We've received a report of a stolen vehicle, a 1967 Ford F-100 dark green. Are you currently in possession of that vehicle?" The world went very quiet. "Who filed the report?" I asked. There was a pause. "Sir, the report was filed by a Jason Bennett. He listed himself as the owner of the vehicle in question." I sat with that for a moment. My son had called the police on me. He had called the police. On his father. On Father's Day. For a truck that had never, not for one single day, belonged to him. "Officer," I said, and my voice was very steady, "I'm going to need you to stay on the line while I pull up the registration on my phone. This is my vehicle. I purchased it. I restored it. I have every document you need." "Of course, sir. Take your time." I found the documents. I read him the registration, the insurance, the purchase records, all of it. There was a long pause on his end. Then he said something I will remember for the rest of my life. "Mr. Bennett, in my experience, these situations, they're usually not really about the object. Whatever's happening between you and your son. I hope you two can work through it." I thanked him. I hung up. And I sat alone in my truck on the side of that road in the last light of that Father's Day. And I finally let myself ask the question I should have asked years ago. How did we get here? The answer was a long one. It started long before that toast. It started on the day I first decided that protecting my son from pain was more important than preparing him for life. And it was going to take more than a conversation to fix it. You're watching this story unfold from wherever you are tonight, and I want to know where that is. Drop your city in the comments right now. Let me see how far this reaches. Because what happened next, what I did the morning after the phone call with my attorney, and what Jason said when he finally came to my door, that's where this story really begins. The morning after Father's Day, I did not sleep. I sat in the kitchen of my house, the same kitchen where I had helped Jason with algebra homework, where Margaret used to make coffee at 5 in the morning before anyone else was awake, where I had sat alone after her funeral and eaten a sandwich someone brought over because I couldn't figure out how to cook for one person, and I sat there until the sun came up. I did not cry again. I had done that on the side of the road the night before, and one round was enough. I was 65 years old. And I had learned a long time ago that grief doesn't care how tough you think you are. It finds you anyway. But there's a difference between letting it move through you and letting it move into you and stay. I had let it move through. Now I needed to think. I poured coffee I didn't drink, and I stared at the wall, and I thought about Officer Davies. Not about Jason. Not about the truck. About that officer. Because something he said wouldn't leave me alone. He said, "In my experience, these situations, they're usually not really about the object." He was right. I knew he was right the moment he said it. But that night, sitting in the kitchen, while the sky outside went from black to gray to the first pale line of morning orange, I started asking myself a harder question. If it wasn't about the truck, Then what was it really about? And the answer that kept surfacing, the one I kept pushing away, and that kept floating back up, was this: it was about me. Not about what Jason had done wrong. About what I had done wrong first. That is not an easy thing to sit with, especially for a man like me. Especially for a man who spent 3 decades running into burning buildings, while other people ran out. A man whose entire identity was built around the idea that he showed up, that he sacrificed, that he did the hard thing when it needed to be done. I had spent years telling myself I was the good parent. The present one. The one who stayed. But sitting in that kitchen at 5 in the morning, I started taking my own story apart piece by piece. And what I found underneath all that sacrifice, underneath all those overtime shifts and paid tuitions and covered debts, was a pattern I hadn't been willing to name. Every time Jason failed, I caught him. Every time Jason crossed a line, I erased it. Every time the consequences of his choices started to close in on him, I stepped between him and those consequences and absorbed them myself. I told myself it was love. Maybe some of it was. But some of it, the part I hadn't wanted to look at, was fear. I was afraid that if I let him fall, he would blame me. I was afraid that if I held a line, he would decide I wasn't worth the effort. I was afraid that if I became someone who said no, who pushed back, who demanded accountability, I would lose him the way I had lost Margaret. And a man who is afraid of losing someone will do almost anything to keep them close. Even if keeping them close means letting them become someone they shouldn't be. I had not saved my son all those years. I had stunted him. And the man who stood in my backyard and said, "I wish you were never my dad," in front of our entire family, that man was in some ways my creation. That was the hardest thing I had ever admitted to myself. Harder than any fire. I picked up the phone at 7:30 in the morning. I called my attorney, Richard Hale, who had been handling my paperwork since I started the training company 12 years ago. Richard was 70, meticulous, and completely unshockable. He had heard every variety of family disaster that money and property could produce, and he never once flinched. He answered on the second ring. "Richard," I said, "I need to come in today." "Thomas?" There was a brief pause. "How bad?" "My son called the police on me last night and reported my truck stolen." A longer pause. "Come in at 9, he said. I was there at 8:55. Richard's office smelled like old paper and coffee, the same way it had smelled for 12 years. He had a photograph of his own son on the desk, grown successful, smiling. I had always noticed that photograph and never said anything about it. I sat down across from him and I told him everything, not just the Father's Day confrontation. Everything. The truck. The cabin comments. The business assumptions. Jason telling Marcus he was going to restructure the board when things came to him. The years of covered debts and paid tuitions and erased lines. All of it. Richard listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always respected about him. He let me talk myself out completely before he said a word. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thomas, can I ask you something direct? That's why I'm here. What do you want to happen?" I had expected a legal question. That one caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said carefully, "there are several things I can do for you right now. I can protect your assets from any future legal claims. I can restructure your estate documents, so there's no ambiguity about ownership of anything. The truck, the cabin, the company, the house. I can draft language so airtight that your son couldn't contest any of it, even if he tried." He paused. "But those are legal solutions to what sounds to me like a family problem. So before I do any of that, I want to know, what do you actually want the outcome to be? Do you want to protect yourself from Jason, or do you want to reach him?" I sat with that for a long moment. Outside the window, Nashville was waking up. I could hear traffic somewhere below. "Both," I finally said. "I want both." Richard nodded slowly. "Then here's what I'd suggest." What he proposed was not what I expected. He suggested we restructure everything, not to punish Jason, not to cut him off, but to close every loophole that had allowed Jason's sense of entitlement to grow roots. The company would move toward an employee ownership structure, transitioning over 3 years. The cabin and the house would be placed under a trust with specific conditions. Jason could still benefit, but benefit would require participation. Contribution. Demonstrated accountability. What you're describing, Richard said, is removing the guarantee. Right now, Jason believes the inheritance is a foregone conclusion. That belief has removed all incentive for him to build his own life. You take away the guarantee, you force him to confront reality. And if that pushes him away completely, Richard looked at me steadily. Thomas, he called the police on you yesterday, on Father's Day, for a truck that belongs to you. The question isn't whether this might push him away. The question is whether the relationship you have right now is actually worth preserving. I didn't have an answer for that, not yet. I drove home from Richard's office, and I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes because I wasn't ready to go inside. The house felt different since yesterday. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. My phone had been buzzing all morning. Missed calls from Jason. 2 texts from Melissa. One from Emma's teacher, which turned out to be unrelated, just a school scheduling thing. But for one brief moment when I saw it, I had the irrational fear that Emma had somehow been affected by all of this, that she had gone to school sad or confused, and the thought of that hit me harder than anything Jason had said. Emma was 8 years old. She had looked at me across that backyard table with those wide eyes after her father said those words, and she had said Grandpa in the smallest voice. She didn't deserve to have that be part of her memory of me. I called Jason at noon. He picked up immediately, which told me he had been waiting. Dad, don't, I said. My voice was calm. I had decided in the car that I was not going to have this conversation from a place of anger. Anger would give him something to push back against. I was going to be something he didn't know how to fight. I was going to be absolutely still. Don't start with an explanation. I want you to answer one question first. A pause. Okay. Did you call the police and report my truck stolen? Silence. Jason. I was angry, he said. That's not what I asked you. Another silence. Longer this time. Yes, he said. I called. I let that sit between us for a moment. You called the police, I said, on your father. On Father's Day. For a vehicle that has never belonged to you. For a vehicle that I purchased and that I restored, and that has my name on the registration and the insurance and every document in existence. You did that. I thought. What did you think, Jason? Tell me exactly what you thought. His voice shifted. Got defensive. I could hear it, that familiar tightening the tone that said he was about to reframe the situation, so he was the reasonable one. I thought you took it specifically to make a point, he said. Like you were trying to take something away from me to hurt me. Something away from you, I repeated. Dad, that truck was never yours. I know that, but do you? Because the way you've been talking for the past 3 years, I'm not sure you do know that. I'm not sure you know what's yours and what's mine. The cabin, the company, the truck, my savings. At what point, Jason, did you decide that my life was your inheritance? The silence on his end was different this time. Not defensive. Something closer to stunned. That's not... Melissa told Linda Carver at Karen's birthday party that the cabin was your family property. You told Marcus at Emma's birthday that you were going to restructure my company when things came to you. You borrowed my truck for a car show without asking. You have introduced my house to people as the family estate. I paused. I let all of it go, every single time. And I am asking myself this morning what I was teaching you by doing that. He didn't answer. I was teaching you that none of it was real, I said. The lines I set, the things that were mine. I kept erasing them every time you pushed, so you learned to keep pushing. That's on me. I own that. Dad. His voice had changed completely now. Something younger in it. Something I hadn't heard in years. I didn't think about it that way. I know you didn't. That's part of the problem. Are you saying you're cutting me off? I almost said no immediately. The reflex was still there, the urge to reassure him, to soften it, to say, of course not. Son, nothing like that. And I caught myself. Because that was the pattern. That was exactly how it had worked every time. I'm saying things are going to change, I told him. I had a meeting this morning. There are going to be some changes to how I have things structured, not to punish you, but because the way things were structured was not working, for either of us. Another long pause. What kind of changes? That's a conversation for when we're in the same room, not on the phone. Dad, you can't just... Jason. My voice stayed level. I want you to understand how hard that was, how much effort it took to keep every single word at the same temperature. You called the police on me yesterday. Your 8-year-old daughter looked at me across that table, after you said what you said, and she said my name in a voice that I am going to hear for a very long time. I cooked since sunrise. I used your mother's recipe. And you stood in front of people we've known for 20 years and told me you wished I was never your father. A pause. I think you owe me a conversation in person. And I think you know that. I was quiet for so long, I thought the call might have dropped. Then he said, barely above a whisper, when? Saturday, I said. My house. Come alone. He said, okay. I hung up. I sat in my driveway for another 10 minutes. Then I went inside, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started writing down everything I wanted to say. Not a list of grievances. Not an accusation sheet. The truth. My full truth about the last 20 years. What I had done right. What I had done wrong. What I had been afraid of. What I needed him to understand. I wrote for 3 hours. My hand cramped around page 7, and I kept going. There are things you spend years not saying because you're afraid of what happens when you say them. And then there comes a point. A Father's Day. A police report. A cracked glass on a picnic table, when the cost of not saying them finally exceeds the cost of saying them. I had reached that point. But Thursday came before Saturday, and Thursday brought something I had not anticipated. I was in the garage. The same garage where I had restored the truck doing inventory on some equipment for the training company when I heard a car pull up. Not Jason's car, Melissa's. She drove a white SUV that was always spotlessly clean. One of those details about her that I had always noticed without attaching meaning to. She got out and she was alone, which was unusual, and she was not carrying anything, which was also unusual, because Melissa always arrived with something food, a gift, some token of the visit. She was empty-handed, and her face told me this was not a social call. Thomas, she said, coming through the side door without knocking. We need to talk. I put down what I was doing. I looked at her. All right, I said. Talk. She had always been controlled, Melissa. That was one of the things I genuinely admired about her in the early days. She was not a woman who let her emotions get ahead of her. She thought before she spoke. She picked her moments. But standing in my garage that Thursday morning, there was something different in her face. She looked scared. Not angry. Scared. I know about the changes you're making, she said. Richard Hale's assistant is married to a woman in my book club. I know you met with him Monday morning, and I know what you're planning. I kept my face neutral. You know what you've heard secondhand. Thomas. She took a breath. I know this looks bad. I know Sunday was... She stopped. Started again. What Jason said was wrong. I want you to know I told him that. I told him that before I even knew you'd left. I pulled him aside, and I told him what he said was cruel and unnecessary, and he needed to call you and apologize. He called the police instead, I said. She closed her eyes briefly. I know. Did you know he was going to do that? No. She said it fast and firm. No, Thomas, I did not know. I was putting Emma to bed when he did it. I found out after the fact, and I... She paused. We had a very significant argument about it. I want you to know that. I believed her. I believed her about that specific thing. Melissa, I said, what are you here to ask me? She met my eyes. I'm asking you to not make any permanent decisions while you're still in the middle of this. I'm asking you to give Jason a chance to make this right before you restructure everything. She paused. We have Emma to think about. Whatever happens between you and Jason. Emma loves you. She's been asking about you every day since Sunday. She wants to know if Grandpa is okay. That landed. I won't pretend it didn't. Emma asking if Grandpa was okay. I looked at Melissa for a long moment. I'm not trying to hurt Emma, I said. I'm not trying to hurt your family. What I'm doing has nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with reality. The reality is that Jason has been living under a set of assumptions that I allowed to form by not correcting them. And those assumptions are not good for him. They're not good for your marriage. And they're not good for Emma, who is going to grow up watching her father and forming her own ideas about how the world works. Melissa was quiet. Your husband needs to build something that belongs to him, I said. Not because I'm taking things away, but because until he does, he's never going to respect himself. And a man who doesn't respect himself cannot be the father Emma deserves. Melissa looked at me for a long moment, and then quietly she said, You're right. I hadn't expected that. I know, she said. I know you're right. And I know I haven't always helped. The things I said about the cabin, I heard what Carl's wife told you. I know. I got caught up in... She shook her head. I got caught up in the idea of what the future was going to look like. And I let that get ahead of reality. I'm not proud of it. The honesty surprised me. More than that, it moved me in the way that unexpected honesty always does. I appreciate you saying that, I told her. Will you still meet with him Saturday? Yes. Will you give him a real chance? I thought about that. I'm going to give him the truth, I said. Whether that becomes a chance depends entirely on what he does with it. She nodded. She left. And I stood in my garage alone with the ghost of that truck and 3 hours of writing on a yellow legal pad, and I started to understand something I hadn't understood clearly before. This was not just about Jason and me. This was about a family that had been quietly organized around a fiction. The fiction that my son would inherit my life, and that everything would simply continue, and what happens to a family when someone finally pulls that fiction apart. It was going to hurt. All of it was going to hurt. But the alternative, keeping the fiction alive, going back to erasing lines, teaching Emma by example that entitlement was something a family could sustain, that was a different kind of pain. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that grows in the dark, and by the time you see it, it has become the whole house. Saturday morning came. I was up at 5 again, same as always. I made coffee. I sat with my legal pad. I read back through what I had written, and I crossed out the parts that were grievance and kept the parts that were truth. By 8 o'clock I had 3 pages. By 9, I had 2. By the time Jason's car pulled into the driveway at 10, I had 1 page. 1 page of the things that actually needed to be said. Everything else, the hurt, the anger, the long list of moments I had swallowed, I had folded up and set aside. Not because it didn't matter, because it wasn't going to help. I heard him knock. He knocked on his father's door like a stranger, which told me everything I needed to know about where his head was. I opened it. He looked like he hadn't slept either. Good, I thought. Then I felt bad for thinking it. Come in, I said. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had helped him with algebra, where Margaret had made coffee before anyone else was awake, where I had eaten a sandwich alone after her funeral, and I sat across from him. And I started to talk. He sat down across from me, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. That kitchen had held a lot of silences over the years. The silence after Margaret told us her diagnosis. The silence after Jason's first business collapsed, and he came to me with the numbers, and we both looked at what they meant without saying it out loud. The silence on the night she died, when it was just the two of us in the hospital parking lot at 2 in the morning, and neither one of us knew how to be the one who spoke first. But this silence was different from all of those. Those silences had been shared grief. 2 people standing in the same fire. This one had a wall in it. I put my 1 page of notes on the table face down, and I looked at my son. He had his mother's eyes and his grandfather's jaw, and he had not shaved in what looked like several days, and he was sitting with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug I had given him when he was in college. Some promotional thing from the university, chipped on the handle, the kind of object that survives 20 years through pure accident, and he was staring at the table like a man waiting for a verdict. I said, "Before I say anything, I want you to talk first." He looked up. "I've been thinking all week about what I want to say to you," I told him. "And I realized this morning that I've been doing that our whole lives. I've been the one who figures out what needs to be said and then says it. And somewhere in that pattern, I stopped making room for you to figure it out yourself." I paused. "So talk. Say whatever you came here to say. I'm going to sit here, and I'm going to listen." Jason stared at me. I think he had expected to walk into a confrontation, a list of accusations. Some version of the argument that had been building between us for years finally let off the leash. He had braced for impact, and instead, I had handed him the floor, and I could see him recalibrating in real time. He set the mug down. He said, "I don't know where to start." "Start anywhere," I said. "Start with Sunday if you want. Start with 10 years ago. Start with whatever's been sitting heaviest on you all week." I was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I called the police because I was furious, and I wanted to hurt you." That landed clean and hard. Not because it surprised me, because he said it without dressing it up. "I know," I said. I'm not trying to justify it. I know it was wrong. I knew it was wrong the second I hung up the phone, but by then I'd already done it, and I didn't know how to undo it without making it worse." He paused. "The officer called me back about an hour after you left. He told me the vehicle was documented as yours, and that if I pursued the claim, it would likely result in a false report charge. He was very patient about it. He could have been a lot less kind." Another pause. I told him I made a mistake. He said he understood. I let that sit. "What made you say it?" I asked. "The toast. What were you thinking in that moment?" Jason looked away, looked back. "I've been carrying something around for a long time," he said. "And Sunday, I don't know, the whole setup of the day felt like another performance, like another thing I was supposed to show up for and be grateful and reflect back to you how good a father you were." He stopped, seemed to hear himself. "That sounds terrible." "Keep going," I said. I felt like I've spent my whole life being the proof that you did a good job. Like my success or failure was always really about you. Like I was the thing that either validated or invalidated Thomas Bennett." He looked at the table. "And I know that's not fair. I know you sacrificed. I know how much you gave up. I know you worked those overtime shifts, and I know you covered my debts, and I know you paid for school. I know all of it." "But," I said. He looked up. "But I never asked you to," he said. "And every time you did it without being asked, it felt like another reminder of what I owed you. Like the debt was just getting bigger and bigger, and I could never, no matter what I did, I could never get ahead of it." I sat with that. I sat with it carefully, because part of me wanted to argue. Part of me wanted to say I never kept score. I never asked you to pay me back. I never once handed you a bill for what I gave. The sacrifice was freely given, and to hear you characterize it as a debt you couldn't escape, that is a misreading of everything I intended. But I held that reaction back. I held it back because I was 65 years old, and I had learned a few things about the difference between what you intend and what someone else receives. You can give someone a gift, and they can experience it as pressure. You can love someone freely, and they can feel the weight of that love as obligation. Both things can be true at the same time. And if the person receiving your love is telling you how it felt, if your son is sitting across from you and telling you what it was like to grow up under the weight of everything you gave, then the only honest thing to do is listen. Even if it hurts. Especially if it hurts. "Keep going," I said again. He let out a long breath. "I think I've been angry at you for a long time," he said. "Not for specific things, just angry. And I never said it because you were always the good guy, the firefighter, the sacrifice, the man who worked 32 years and never complained. How do you tell that guy you're angry at him without sounding like the worst person alive? You say it to his face on Father's Day in front of 30 people." I said. A sharp silence. Then something shifted in Jason's face, and he made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob and landed somewhere between the two. "Yeah," he said. "I guess you do." We sat with that for a moment. "I'm not going to tell you your feelings were wrong," I said. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you that what you described feeling like my giving made you feel indebted, feeling like you were always performing your gratitude. I'm not going to tell you that was an irrational response to what I was doing. Because the truth is, I was doing it partly for me. I need you to hear that. He looked at me. I was afraid, I said. After your mother died, I was terrified of losing you too. And the way I know how to keep people, the way I know how to make sure someone stays, is to be needed. I kept you needing me. I did that. I told myself I was protecting you. But a part of it was that I needed you to need me because that meant you couldn't leave. Jason was very still. I made myself indispensable, I said. And in doing that, I made it so you never had to become capable. And then I was surprised when you became a man who expected everything to be handed to him. I stopped. I built that. I'm not taking full responsibility for who you choose to be. You're a grown man, and the choices are yours. But I am telling you that I helped create the conditions. And I'm sorry for that. Jason put his elbows on the table and put his face in his hands. He stayed that way for a while. When he looked up, his eyes were red. Mom would be so disappointed in me, he said. That hit me somewhere I wasn't ready for. Your mother, I said, and I had to stop for a second and get my footing, loved you more than she loved anything. She would not be disappointed in you. She would be worried about you. There's a difference. She would have called me out long before Sunday, he said. Yes, I agreed. She absolutely would have. Something close to a sad smile crossed his face. She would have done it by making me a sandwich and then sitting across from me, exactly the way you're sitting now, and not letting me leave until I was honest. He paused. She was better at this than either of us. She was better at most things, I said. We were both quiet for a moment with that. Then I turned over the page of notes. I want to tell you about the changes, I said. Not as a punishment. I want you to understand the reasoning. His jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. I told him about the employee ownership structure for the company. I told him about the trust for the property. I told him what Richard had suggested and why I had agreed with it. He listened. He didn't interrupt, which was not what I expected. I had expected the defensiveness, the pushback, the argument. But he sat, and he listened, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're not cutting me out." "No. But I don't just automatically get it." "No," I said. "You don't." "What would I have to do?" "Build something," I said. "Something real. Something where nobody is handing you anything. Something where the only reason you succeed is because of what you're capable of." I paused. "Not because you're Thomas Bennett's son. Because you're Jason Bennett." He looked at the table. "I don't know if I know how to do that," he said. And that right there, that quiet, unguarded admission, was the first genuinely honest thing he had said to me in years. Not a defense, not a deflection, not an argument about what he was owed. Just, "I don't know if I know how to do that." "I know," I said. "That's actually the problem. You're 41 years old and you genuinely don't know if you can make it without the safety net. And that's on me as much as it's on you. But the only way to find out is to try." I leaned forward. "And I want to tell you something, Jason, and I want you to hear this clearly. I believe you can. I have always believed you could. The same energy you use to count on my things being yours, that energy redirected is enough to build something real. I've seen it in you, the charm, the vision, the way people respond to you. That's not something I gave you. That's yours. That's always been yours." He was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him in so long I had almost forgotten it existed. He looked like the 19-year-old boy I had stood next to in a hospital parking lot at 2 in the morning. He looked like he needed his father, and he knew it. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. And then he said it again differently. Not the automatic apology, the one people produce when they know it's expected. The second time he said it, it came from somewhere lower and quieter. "I'm sorry. For Sunday. For the truck. For the way I've been talking about your things like they were already mine. For making you feel like—" He stopped. "Melissa told me what you said to her. That you kept erasing the lines because you were afraid I'd leave if you didn't. And I—" His voice broke briefly, and he pulled it back. "You shouldn't have had to be afraid of your own son leaving. I should have been someone you could trust not to do that. I wasn't. And I'm sorry. I reached across the table. I put my hand on top of his. I said, "We're going to be okay." He nodded. He pressed his lips together and nodded. And we sat there at that kitchen table, the same table that had held every hard moment of our lives together. And for the first time in longer than I could measure, it felt like we were in the same fire. Not against each other. Just two people in the same hard place, figuring out how to find the way out. But what I didn't know, what neither of us could have predicted, sitting at that table that Saturday morning, was that the real test hadn't arrived yet. I thought the hard part was behind us. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a man named Gerald Marsh. Gerald Marsh was a business developer out of Memphis, and he had been in conversation with Jason for how long I would find out later. It had been almost 8 months about acquiring my training company. Not the new structure, not the employee ownership plan. My original company. The one I had built from scratch over 12 years. The one with my name on it. Jason had been in preliminary negotiations to broker a sale without my knowledge. Without my knowledge. For 8 months. While we were having Sunday dinners. While he was borrowing my truck for car shows. While I was planning a Father's Day party and buying ribs and putting up backyard lights. My son had been meeting with a developer in Memphis about selling something that was not his to sell. Gerald Marsh called me because the employee ownership restructuring had just been filed with the state, and he had discovered in the course of his due diligence that Jason did not in fact have any authority to represent the company in any capacity. He called me, I believe, because he was an honest man who was uncomfortable with what he had walked into. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "I want to be upfront with you. I'm not sure your son was fully transparent with me about the nature of his ownership stake. I think there may have been some misrepresentation involved, and I am not interested in proceeding under those circumstances. I thought you deserved to know." I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen. I thought about the conversation 3 weeks ago. The apology. The red eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad." The hand under mine on the table. "We're going to be okay." And then I thought about 8 months. 8 months of meetings I didn't know about. 8 months of my son walking around telling a developer in Memphis that he had the authority to negotiate the sale of what I built. I picked up the phone. I called Jason. He answered on the first ring. "Gerald Marsh just called me," I said. The silence on his end was its own kind of answer. "Dad." "How long?" I said. "Dad, it wasn't what?" "How long, Jason?" A pause. "Since last October," he said. October. 8 months before Father's Day. 2 months after Emma's birthday party, where he had told Marcus he was going to restructure my board. The timeline was clicking into place in a way that made my stomach drop. "Were the negotiations the reason you were in a bad mood on Sunday?" I asked. "Did something go wrong with Marsh? Is that what happened?" Another pause. Longer. "He got cold feet in May," Jason said. "He said he needed to do more due diligence. I was waiting for him to come back. When he went quiet, I thought..." He stopped. "I thought maybe if I got you to change the structure on your own, it would complicate the sale enough that you'd have to involve me to untangle it. I thought..." He stopped again. I waited. "I thought I could get ahead of it," he said. "I thought if I was already positioned as the one managing the transition, it would be too complicated to cut me out." The full picture was assembling itself, and I did not like what it looked like. "The toast on Sunday," I said slowly. "That wasn't just you losing your temper." He didn't answer. "Jason, was Sunday a strategy? Were you trying to provoke me into doing something that would give you leverage?" The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. And the answer it contained the thing he didn't say, but the silence said for him changed the weight of everything that had come before. Not the apology, not the tears, not the hand under mine. All of it sat differently now. I was 65 years old. I had walked into burning buildings for 32 years. I had never in my life felt as outmaneuvered as I did in that kitchen sitting alone with a phone in my hand. "I need you to come back," I said. "Today, this afternoon." "Dad." "Today, Jason." I hung up. And I sat there. And I did the hardest thing a man can do, when he has just discovered that someone he loves has been playing a longer game than he knew. I did not react. I breathed. I thought. I gave myself 1 hour to feel what I felt, the betrayal, the disbelief, the grief of it, and then I set it aside. Because if there was one thing 32 years in the fire service had taught me, it was this: the moment when everything seems most out of control is precisely the moment when you cannot afford to lose yours. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon. He knocked again like a stranger. I opened the door. I looked at my son, and I said, "Come in, sit down, and this time, don't leave anything out." He sat down across from me, and this time, he didn't touch the coffee. He sat with his hands flat on the table, not wrapped around anything, not fidgeting, just flat, like a man who had decided the time for small gestures was over. I sat across from him, and I waited. "Start at the beginning," I said. "The real beginning, not October. Before that." He looked at me. "How far back do you want to go?" "Far enough that I understand how my son ended up in secret meetings with a developer in Memphis for 8 months without telling me." He took a breath, and then he told me. He told me that it started not in October, but the previous spring at a dinner with some of his business contacts in Nashville. A man at the table, someone in commercial real estate, someone Jason had met through a mutual connection, had asked him about my training company. Asked him in a casual, conversational way, the way people ask about things at dinner. "What does it do? How long has it been running? What's the revenue model?" And Jason had answered. He had answered in detail. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, the man had said, "That sounds like exactly the kind of operation Gerald Marsh is looking for. He's been trying to get into the emergency training space for 2 years. You should talk to him." Jason looked at the table. "I told myself it was just a conversation," he said. "I told myself I was just gathering information, that I wasn't committing to anything, that I was just exploring." "But you didn't tell me," I said. "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I knew you'd shut it down," he said. "The second I mentioned Marsh's name, you would have said the company wasn't for sale, and that would have been the end of it." "The company isn't for sale," I said. "It has never been for sale. I built it to provide security for the people who work there and to fund a foundation for retired firefighters. I have told you this. I told you this years ago." "I know." "Then why?" "Because I thought you were wrong," he said, and he said it with a directness that surprised me. Not defensive, not angry, just direct. "I thought you were being sentimental. I thought you were holding on to something out of pride when the smart move was to take a significant payout and let someone with real capital grow it into something bigger. I thought I could see the business clearly in a way you couldn't because you were too emotionally attached to it." I looked at my son. "And Marsh," I said, "what did he offer?" Jason named a number. I will not write the number here because it is not the point. But it was a significant number. The kind of number that changes what the rest of your life looks like. The kind of number that I understood immediately why Jason had not been able to walk away from the conversation. I sat with it. "And your cut?" I asked. He looked at me. "I was going to present it to you as a done deal," he said. "Marsh was going to make a formal offer with everything structured. I was going to come to you with the full package and present it as the obvious choice. I was going to tell you that the employees would be taken care of, that the foundation could be endowed with part of the proceeds, and that the rest would go to you," I said. "A percentage," he said, "for brokering the deal." I said nothing. "Dad, you were going to come to me with a sale of my company already negotiated," I said, behind my back, after months of meetings I didn't know about, and present it as a done deal and expect me to sign. He didn't answer because there was nothing to answer. That was exactly what he had been planning. "And Sunday," I said. He looked at the table. "Marsh went cold in May," he said. "He said he needed to revisit the valuation. I knew what that meant. It meant his financing had shifted, and he was looking for a lower number." I panicked. I had been building this for 8 months and suddenly it was falling apart, and I had nothing to show for it, and I came to Sunday already in a bad place. He paused. "And then I saw you, and the decorations, and all the food, and I just I felt this rage that I didn't know what to do with. Because you were standing there being the good father, the sacrificing father, and I had been running around behind your back for 8 months, trying to sell something that wasn't mine, and the dissonance of it just... He stopped. I broke. You broke, I repeated. I said the worst thing I could think of, he said. Because I wanted to hurt you before you could hurt me. Because I knew eventually you were going to find out about Marsh, and I wanted to get ahead of it somehow by... He shook his head. It doesn't make sense. I know it doesn't make sense. I was out of my mind. And the truck, I said. Calling the police. Same thing. I was already gone by then. I don't know what I needed. To win something. To feel like I had control of something. The truck was there, and I called, and the moment I hung up, I knew I had made everything worse. The kitchen was very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear a dog somewhere down the street. I looked at my son, and I made myself see him clearly. Not the version of him I wanted him to be. Not the man I had spent 41 years shaping in my imagination. The actual man in front of me. Scared. Cornered by his own choices. 41 years old and still trying to win by burning things down because he didn't know how else to fight. And the terrible thing, the thing I had to hold on to, because it was true, even when it was inconvenient, was that I understood him, not the Marsh situation. That was a step I had not anticipated and could not fully excuse. But the rage underneath it. The feeling of being in someone else's shadow so long that you start to think the only way out is to grab what you can and run. The feeling of looking at a life that should have been yours by now and still not being able to call any of it your own. I understood that. Not because it was right, but because I had helped build it. Here's what I need you to understand, I said, and I need you to hear every word of this. He looked at me. What you did with Marsh was not just a business mistake, I said. It was a betrayal. Not because it involved money, because it involved months of looking me in the eyes and saying nothing. Months of sitting at this table and having dinner and talking about Emma's school and letting me believe we were building back towards something while all the time you were sitting on a secret that had the potential to take apart everything I built. I paused. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a choice. You made it over and over again for 8 months, and I need you to sit with what that means. His jaw was tight. His eyes were wet. He didn't look away. I know, he said. I need more than I know, I said. I need you to tell me why. Not the practical reason. I understand the practical reason. Marsh offered a number that seemed to solve everything. I get that. I need you to tell me what you were thinking every time you sat across from me during those 8 months and said nothing. What were you telling yourself? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I was telling myself you'd understand once it was done. That when you saw the number, when you saw that the employees were protected and the foundation was endowed, you'd realize I had done something good, something smart, something that proved I could handle big things. He stopped. I was telling myself that for once, I would be the one who fixed something instead of the one who needed fixing. And there it was. That was the thing underneath everything. Not greed, not malice. Something lonelier and more complicated than either of those. A son who had spent his whole life being the person who needed help, who wanted just once to be the person who arrived with the solution. Who wanted his father to look at him and say, you did that. Not me. You. I sat with that for a long time. I sat with it until I was sure I could speak from the right place. Jason, I said, if you had come to me in October, if you had sat right where you're sitting now and said, Dad, I met a developer named Gerald Marsh, and he's interested in the company. I think you should hear what he has to say. What do you think would have happened? He thought about it. You would have said it wasn't for sale, he said. Probably, I said. Initially. But if you had made a case, if you had brought me numbers and projections and a real argument for why the sale made sense, not as a done deal, not as something you had already negotiated behind my back, but as a conversation between two adults who both care about what happens to what I built. Do you think I'm so rigid that I couldn't have listened? He opened his mouth, closed it. I don't know, he said slowly. You don't know, I repeated, because you never tried. You decided before you started that I would say no, so you found a way to make the decision for me. And that is the thing you keep doing, Jason. You keep deciding in advance what other people will or won't give you, and then you find ways to take it without asking. I leaned forward. Where did you learn that? He shook his head. No, I said. I want you to really think about it. Where did you learn that when something isn't offered, you find a way around the front door? The silence stretched. Then quietly he said, From watching you. I went still. From watching you manage everything, he said. Handle everything. Fix everything before anyone had to ask. You never waited to be asked, Dad. You looked at a problem and you solved it. You covered my debts before I came to you. You talked to the principal before I knew there was a meeting. You always just... He stopped. You showed me that love means doing things for people before they know they need it. And I translated that into, if I can make this happen before he knows it's happening, I'm doing it out of love. I'm handling it. I sat back. Because that was not a defense. That was a mirror. And the man looking back at me in it was not entirely a stranger. I had done that. I had modeled exactly that. The love that acts before it asks. The help that arrives before the need is voiced. The protection that doesn't wait for permission. And my son had learned the lesson. He had just applied it in a direction that served himself instead of others. I rubbed my face with both hands. We are, I said, a real piece of work, the two of us. And Jason laughed. Not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh that escapes when something is simultaneously devastating and absurd, and you have no other outlet for it. We really are, he said. We sat there for a moment in something that was not quite comfort and not quite peace, but was at least honest. Then I said, I want to talk about what happens next. He straightened slightly. The Marsh situation, I said, is over. I'm going to call him Monday and tell him clearly that there is no deal and no representative, and the company is not for sale. That conversation is going to be brief, and it is going to close that door permanently. Are we clear on that? Yes, Jason said. No argument. The restructuring continues, I said. The employee ownership plan moves forward exactly as Richard has structured it. That does not change. I understand. But I want to add something to what Richard and I discussed, I said. I want to add a role for you. Not ownership, not a guaranteed stake. A role, a real one, with responsibilities and accountability and performance metrics. Something where you are evaluated by the same standards as anyone else, and where the people who work there can see that you are earning whatever position you hold. I paused. If you want it. He looked at me. You'd still want me involved, he said. After all of this. I want you involved because of all of this, I said. Because you just sat across from me and told me the truth. The full truth. With nothing left out. Do you understand how rare that is? Do you understand how many people would have walked in here and constructed a story that made themselves look better? I shook my head. You didn't do that. You told me exactly what happened and exactly why. That took something, Jason. That took the kind of honesty I wasn't sure you still had in you. His throat moved. Don't give me too much credit, he said. I almost didn't come. What made you? I was quiet for a moment. Emma, he said. Emma asked me this morning if Grandpa was still her grandpa. She asked me if you were going to stop coming to her school things. His voice was rough. She's 8 years old, and she's worried she's losing you because of something I did. I couldn't... He stopped. I couldn't walk in here and lie to you after that. I couldn't do it. Emma, 8 years old. Grandpa. Are you still my grandpa? I pressed the back of my hand to my mouth for a moment. Then I put both hands flat on the table, and I looked at my son. Tell Emma, I said, that Grandpa is not going anywhere. He nodded. He pressed his lips together and nodded and looked at the ceiling for a moment. And then something happened that I did not expect. Melissa walked in. She had a key I had given her 1 year ago for emergencies, and she walked in quietly, and she was holding Emma's hand, and Emma was in her school clothes still, and she had clearly been crying, and when she saw me, she crossed that kitchen in about 4 steps, and she grabbed me around the middle and held on. I looked at Melissa over Emma's head. Melissa's eyes were wet. She mouthed, "I'm sorry." We were in the car. She wouldn't wait. I held my granddaughter. I held her, and I felt 8 years old and 65 years old simultaneously, and I thought about Margaret, who would have handled all of this so much better than either of us. And I thought about 32 years of running into burning buildings, and I thought about how none of that, not one single moment of it, had prepared me for the specific weight of an 8-year-old girl who needed to know her grandfather was still there. "I'm here, Bug," I said into her hair. "Grandpa's right here." She pulled back and looked at me with her mother's eyes. No, her grandmother's eyes. Margaret's eyes, the same shape and color that had been looking at me across kitchen tables for 40 years, and she said, "Are you and Daddy friends again?" I looked at Jason. Jason was looking at his daughter with an expression I will carry with me for whatever time I have left. "We're working on it," I told her. "That's what families do. They work on it." She considered this with the seriousness that 8-year-olds bring to important questions. Then she said, "Okay, but can we have ribs? Because Daddy said you make the best ribs, and we haven't had them since your party, and that was sad." And somehow in the middle of everything I laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and surprised. "Yeah," I said, "we can have ribs." But nothing after that afternoon was simple. Nothing was suddenly fixed. The conversation Jason and I had that day was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a long and difficult process of rebuilding. And rebuilding is slow work. Slower than destruction. Always slower. There were weeks in the months that followed where Jason and I spoke briefly and carefully, like two men still learning whether the bridge between them would hold weight. There were phone calls that ended too soon, and silences that lasted too long, and moments where I picked up the phone to call him and then set it back down because I wasn't sure I was ready, and neither was he. There was a Wednesday afternoon in August when I found out through Richard that Jason had reached back out to Marsh independently, not to restart negotiations. Richard assured me, but to formally close the door himself. To call the man and say clearly, and without my instigation, that there was no deal and there never would be, and he was sorry for misrepresenting his position. He had done it without me telling him to. He had done it because he needed to close it himself. When Richard told me that, I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a hardware store, and I did not move for about 10 minutes. There was a Thursday in September when Jason showed up at the training company without calling ahead. Not to see me. He didn't know I was there. He came because he wanted to talk to Dennis Carver, who had been my operations manager for 9 years. Dennis was 54, a former paramedic, one of the best people I had ever worked with. He had known Jason since Jason was in his 20s and had watched everything that had unfolded over the years with the careful eyes of someone who loved me enough to stay quiet and trusted me enough to let me make my own mistakes. I was in the back when Jason arrived, and I heard the conversation through the wall. Jason asked Dennis to explain how the employee ownership structure worked, not arguing against it, not looking for a loophole, asking how it worked. He asked Dennis what the biggest operational challenges were. He asked what the staff needed that they didn't currently have. He asked what Dennis thought the company needed to grow in the next 5 years. He asked, like someone who was trying to understand, not like someone who was trying to acquire. I was there for almost 2 hours. When he left, I came out of the back and Dennis looked at me. "Your boy," Dennis said carefully, "asked good questions today." I nodded. "He really listening?" Dennis asked. "I think he might be," I said, "for the first time." Dennis nodded slowly. "Well, we'll see." That was September. It was not a fairy tale. It was not an instant transformation. It was a man learning at 41 years old what it felt like to approach something with curiosity instead of entitlement. And it was uncomfortable for him, and it was slow, and there were setbacks, and there were moments where the old patterns surfaced, and I had to decide each time whether to call them out or let them pass. I called them out. Every time. Because that was the thing I had stopped doing for 20 years, and I was not going to make that mistake again. The first time I called him out was a Tuesday in October, about 3 months after Father's Day. He had made a comment in a group, text me him, Melissa, Carl, and his wife, a few others, about the lake cabin. Something about how he was looking forward to using it for Thanksgiving. He had not asked. He had announced. I called him within 5 minutes. He picked up. I said, "Did you ask?" A pause. "Dad." "Jason, did you ask?" A longer pause. "No," he said. "Then ask," I said. Another pause. Then, "Dad, can we use the cabin for Thanksgiving?" "Yes," I said. "You're welcome anytime. You just have to ask." Silence. Then, "Okay. Okay," I said, and I hung up. And I smiled. Because that was it. That was what 20 years of letting it go had prevented. 30 seconds. One phone call. One question asked and one answer given. That was all it had ever needed to be. Thanksgiving at the cabin was the first time in years that I didn't feel like I was performing something. That sounds like a strange thing to say about a holiday dinner. But if you've spent enough time being the patriarch, the provider, the man at the head of the table who everyone is watching to see if he approves, if he's proud, if he's satisfied, you understand what I mean. There is a version of family togetherness that is really just a performance review dressed up with food and football. Everyone playing their role. Everyone managing their image. Everyone carefully not saying the things that need saying. Thanksgiving at the cabin was not that. It was loud and slightly disorganized, and Emma spilled cranberry sauce on the tablecloth within the first 10 minutes, and instead of Melissa tensing up the way she used to. When things didn't go according to plan. She just laughed and grabbed a dish towel and said, "Well, that tablecloth had a good run." And Jason laughed too, a real laugh, not a performance. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched my family, and I felt something I hadn't felt in so long. I almost didn't recognize it. I felt light. Not happy exactly. Not the uncomplicated happiness of someone who has never been through anything. More like the specific lightness that comes when you have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and you have finally carefully set it down. Jason found me in the kitchen about an hour before dinner. He had been helping Dennis's wife set the table. Dennis and his wife had come along with Carl and his wife and a couple of other people from the training company, because I had decided this year that family was not just blood, and he walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter and watched me work for a moment. "You need help?" he asked. "I need you to not get in the way," I said. "Which means stand right where you are and don't touch anything." He smiled. "Dad," he said. I got a job offer this week." I looked up. "From who?" "A company out of Knoxville. Emergency Management Consulting. They want someone to build out their training division." He paused. "They found me through some of the work I've been doing with Dennis. Apparently Dennis mentioned me to someone at a conference." I set down what I was holding. I looked at my son. "Dennis recommended you, apparently." He said it with a kind of careful wonder, like he was still getting used to the idea. "I didn't ask him to. I didn't even know he was going to that conference. He told them about the work I'd been doing and they reached out." Dennis Carver. 9 years with me. 54 years old. Careful, deliberate, a man who did not give his endorsement lightly. Dennis had recommended my son. Not because Jason was Thomas Bennett's son. Because of what Jason had been doing. Because of the questions he had asked. The hours he had put in. The slow, unglamorous work of learning something from the ground up, without anyone promising him ownership of it at the end. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "I told them I needed a few days to think about it," he said. "I told them I had some commitments I needed to consider before I gave them an answer." "What commitments?" He met my eyes. "You. The work here. I didn't want to just disappear without talking to you first." I turned back to the stove. I stood there for a moment with my back to him. "Take the job," I said. "Dad." "Jason." I turned around. "Take the job. That's exactly what I've been asking you to do for the past 6 months. Go build something that belongs to you. Go be Jason Bennett somewhere that nobody cares that your father is Thomas Bennett. Go find out what you can actually do." I paused. "That's not me pushing you away. That's me telling you that you're ready." He was very still. "You think I'm ready?" he said. "I think Dennis Carver thinks you're ready," I said. And Dennis Carner has never been wrong about a person in his life. Something crossed Jason's face that I can only describe as the expression of a man who has been waiting a very long time to hear something and has almost stopped believing he ever would. He crossed the kitchen and he hugged me. Not the careful, managed hug of two people who are being polite. A real one. The kind Emma gave me the day she walked into my kitchen and grabbed me around the middle. The kind that doesn't calculate anything. I held my son in my kitchen, and I thought, there you are. There's the boy I was looking for. Thanksgiving dinner was loud and good, and Emma told everyone 3 separate times about how she was going to be a veterinarian who also played professional soccer, and nobody pointed out the logistical challenges of that career plan, because she was 8 years old, and the world was still entirely possible. I watched my son that afternoon. I watched him help clear dishes without being asked. I watched him sit next to Dennis and have a real conversation. Not the conversation of someone who is managing an impression, but the conversation of someone who is genuinely interested. I watched him look at Melissa with something that had been missing from how they moved around each other for a long time, something that looked like partnership instead of alliance. And I watched him watch me. At one point across the table our eyes met. He raised his glass slightly. Not a toast, not a speech, just a small private acknowledgement. I raised mine back. That was enough. That was more than enough. But the story doesn't end at Thanksgiving dinner, because real life doesn't work that way, and I have never been interested in telling you a version of events that is cleaner than what actually happened. December was harder. Jason took the Knoxville job and started in January, and the transition period, the weeks between accepting and starting, the weeks of winding down. What he had been doing here, the weeks of Melissa managing the household during the adjustment, those weeks were tense in ways that occasionally spilled into our phone calls. There was a night in mid-December when he called me at 11 at night, which he never did, and I answered, and he sounded like a man standing at the edge of something. I don't know if I made the right call, he said. About what specifically? Any of it. Knoxville. Leaving what I had here. All of it. A pause. What if I go there and I'm not good enough without the Bennett name behind me? What if I get there and people figure out that I've been coasting on your reputation for 20 years and there's actually nothing underneath it? I sat up in bed. I turned on the lamp. Are you asking me that as a real question? I said. Or are you asking me because it's 11 o'clock and you're scared and you need someone to talk you down? A pause. Both, he said. Probably both. Okay, I said. Then I'll give you both answers. The real answer is, I don't know if you're good enough. I think you are. I think the last 6 months showed something real. But I can't guarantee it because no one can guarantee anything, and the only way to find out is to go. I paused. And the 11 o'clock answer is every person who has ever done something real has stood exactly where you're standing. Scared that there's nothing underneath the surface. That fear is not evidence of emptiness. It's evidence that you're taking it seriously. I was quiet. Your mother used to get that way, I said. Before anything that mattered to her. Before her first day teaching. Before we had you. She'd go quiet, and I'd know she was in her head, and I'd ask her what she was afraid of, and she'd always say the same thing. What? He asked. She'd say, I'm afraid I'm not as good as I think I should be by now. I paused. And then she'd do it anyway. And she was always better than she gave herself credit for. A long silence on his end. I miss her, he said. I know, I said. Me too, every single day. Do you think she'd be okay with who I'm trying to become? After everything. I did not answer immediately. I sat with that question the way it deserved to be sat with. I think, I said carefully, that your mother loved you in a way that had no conditions attached to it. And I think she would look at the man who called his father at 11 o'clock and said, I'm scared, and told the truth about it, and she would say, yes. Yes, baby, I see you trying. That's exactly what I would have wanted. I heard him breathe. Okay, he said. After a moment, okay. Get some sleep, I said. You've got a lot of work to do. Yeah, he said. I do. He hung up. I sat in the dark for a while with the lamp on, And I thought about 32 years in the fire service and what they had actually taught me. People always ask what the worst part of the job was. They expect you to say the fires, the danger, the physical risk. And those things were real. But the worst part was never the burning buildings. The worst part was arriving too late. The worst part was standing outside a structure that was too far gone and knowing that whatever was inside could not be reached anymore. That the moment had passed. That the window had closed. I had spent the last 6 months terrified I had arrived too late for my son. That the years of erased lines and covered debts and unspoken fears had done damage that couldn't be undone. That the man who stood in my backyard and said, "I wish you were never." My dad was the finished product that was who Jason Bennett had become, and the father who had helped shape him would just have to live with it. But sitting in my bedroom at 11:15 on a December night, I understood something I had not let myself believe until that moment. I had not arrived too late. I had arrived right on time. The window had not closed. It had just required a different kind of entry. January came. Jason moved to Knoxville. Not far, 2 hours, but far enough to matter. Far enough that Emma had to switch some of her activities to accommodate the distance. Far enough that our Sunday dinners became phone calls some weeks and in-person visits others. I will tell you honestly that the first few weeks after he left were quieter than I expected. Not lonely exactly, just quieter. I had gotten used to a certain rhythm over the previous 6 months. The unexpected visits, the calls, the sense that something was being built between us. And when Jason left for Knoxville, the rhythm changed, and I had to find a new one. I threw myself back into the company, not as the owner managing from a distance, but genuinely in it. I sat in on training sessions. I went back to doing some of the instruction myself, which I hadn't done in 3 years. I was in the room when the employee ownership structure formally transferred a Tuesday in February. Not a ceremony exactly. Just a meeting with the lawyers and the signatures. But Dennis shook my hand afterward and held it for a moment longer than a handshake required and said, "You built something good, Thomas." And I had to look at the ceiling for a second. I built something good. 12 years ago, I had started that company with a rented office and 2 employees, both of them former firefighters, who trusted me because they had known me for decades. I had built it into something that employed 23 people and trained first responders across 4 states. And now it belonged to those 23 people in a real and legally binding way. I had not lost it when I restructured it. I had finally given it to the people who had always deserved it most. February brought the first piece of news from Knoxville. Jason called on a Friday afternoon, which was unusual. He typically called on Sunday evenings, and I could hear something in his voice before he said a word. "What happened?" I said. "Nothing bad," he said, and I could hear him smiling. "I ran my first training session by myself today, full group. No backup, no supervisor watching. Just me and 15 emergency managers from 3 counties." "How'd it go?" A pause that contained something I had not heard in my son's voice in a very long time. Pride. Clean, uncomplicated, self-generated pride. "It went well, Dad," he said. "It went really well. People were engaged. I knew the material. Someone came up to me afterward and said it was the best session they'd attended all year." I closed my eyes. "That's my boy," I said. "I'm pretty sure I stole at least 3 of your teaching techniques," he said. "Those aren't mine," I told him. "I stole them from a captain I had in my 2nd year who could explain anything to anyone. You come by the theft honestly." He laughed. A real laugh. Easy and unguarded. We talked for 40 minutes that afternoon about nothing in particular the session. Emma's soccer team, a book he was reading, a problem with my kitchen sink that had been annoying me for a week. The conversation of 2 people who genuinely like each other. The conversation we should have been having for years. When we hung up, I sat in the good quiet that conversation left behind. Not the quiet of absence, the quiet of sufficiency, the quiet of enough. March arrived, and with it something I had not anticipated. A letter. Handwritten. Which nobody does anymore, which is exactly why it stopped me when I pulled it from the mailbox. Jason's handwriting, which was messier than mine, and always had been. Margaret used to tease him about it. I opened it standing at the mailbox. I didn't wait to get inside. The letter was 4 pages. I am not going to read you the whole letter, because it belongs to me and to Jason, and some things should stay between a father and his son. But I will tell you what it said in the ways that matter. He wrote about his mother, about the things he remembered about her that he had never told me, not because they were secret, but because we had never had the kind of conversations where those memories could surface. He wrote about the night she died and what he had been thinking in the hospital parking lot when I stood next to him, and neither of us knew how to speak first. He wrote that what he had wanted to say that night and hadn't was that he was afraid of becoming someone she would be disappointed in. And then he wrote that he thought for a long time he had used that fear as a reason to not try, rather than a reason to be better. That it was easier to coast on what I had built than to build something himself and risk failing at it, and have that failure mean something about who he was. He wrote, "I have spent 20 years borrowing your identity because I was terrified of discovering that my own wasn't good enough. I told myself I was just practical, just realistic, just playing the hand I was dealt. But the truth is that I was hiding, and what I was hiding from was myself." And then, near the end of the letter, he wrote something that I have read many times since. He wrote, "Dad, the hardest thing you ever did for me was not all the times you stepped in. It was the one time you stepped back. It was the morning after Father's Day, when you could have called me and made it okay, and you didn't. It was the meeting with Richard that you had without telling me first. It was every line you held when I expected you to erase it. That's the thing that finally made me grow up. Not your help. Your refusal to keep helping in the ways that were hurting me. I didn't understand it at the time. I do now." I stood at the mailbox and I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table, and I wrote him back. My letter was shorter than his. I have never been the man who finds it easy to put the interior things on paper. Margaret was better at that too. But I told him the truth. I told him that the bravest thing I ever did in 32 years was not any fire I ran into. It was the morning after Father's Day when I sat in this kitchen until sunrise, and finally asked myself the question I had been avoiding for 2 decades. What am I actually teaching my son by never letting him fall? I told him that the answer to that question was the most uncomfortable thing I had ever sat with. More uncomfortable than smoke. More uncomfortable than heat. Because at least in a fire, you know who the enemy is. I told him that I was proud of him. Not the reflexive proud, not the proud that a father produces, because it is expected. The specific, earned, concrete proud of a man who has watched someone he loves make the choice to be better, and then actually do the work of being better. I told him your mother would want you to know that too. I sealed the letter and drove to the post office myself because I didn't want to leave it in the mailbox and have something happen to it. The woman at the counter looked at me a little sideways. People don't mail handwritten letters much anymore, and I said, "It's important." And she smiled and took it. April came, and April brought Father's Day planning. Not the holiday that was still 2 months away, but Emma, who had decided sometime in March that this Father's Day was going to be different, and had recruited Melissa, and apparently Dennis and Carl's wife, and approximately everyone else in the orbit of our family to make sure of it. I found out about the planning. The way I found out about most things that Emma was involved in accidentally, because Emma could not keep a secret to save her life, which was one of the things I loved most about her. She called me on a Wednesday in April, not her parents' phone, her own tablet, and she said, "Grandpa, I have a question," in the tone of voice that meant she was about to tell me something she'd been instructed not to tell me. "What's the question, Bug? Do you like surprises?" "That depends on the surprise." "What if the surprise was really good?" "Then I'd probably like it." A pause. "What if it was a party but a different kind of party than last time, like a good one?" I smiled. "Emma." "Yeah." "Are you planning something for Father's Day?" A very long pause. "Maybe," she said. "Then I like surprises," I told her. She hung up approximately 2 seconds later, and I heard her in the background saying something to Melissa that ended with, "I didn't tell him anything." I laughed for about 5 minutes. Father's Day arrived on a Sunday in June that was warm without being brutal, which is a minor miracle in Tennessee, and I took it as a good sign. Jason picked me up at my house at 10 in the morning. He drove up in a truck I had not seen before. Not new, used, a few years old, modest, but clean and solid and entirely his. He got out and he was smiling, and I walked out the front door and I looked at the truck and I looked at him and I said, "Is that yours?" "Bought it last month," he said. "First vehicle I've ever owned outright. No loan, no help, paid cash." I walked around it once. It was a good truck. Simple, reliable. The kind of truck that does what it's supposed to do without announcing itself. "What do you think?" he asked, and there was something young in how he asked it, something that reminded me of the 24-year-old who had laid out his business spreadsheets on this kitchen table with the confidence of someone who had already succeeded. Except this was different. This was not confidence borrowed from me. This was his. I said, "It's the finest truck I've ever seen." He laughed and shook his head. "It's a 2019 F-150. "It's yours," I said. "That makes it the finest truck I've ever seen." We drove to a park outside Nashville, where apparently everyone I had ever known was waiting. Emma had not understated her ambitions. Carl and his wife, Dennis and his, Melissa's parents who I had not seen in over a year, some of the people from the training company. The couple from down the street who had been at the Father's Day party the year before and had spent most of it looking at the wood grain of the fence. No decorations this time, no attempt to impress anyone, just people. Good people who had known me through the hard parts and were there to say, "We see you, and we're glad you're still standing." Emma found me within 30 seconds of arriving and attached herself to my side for most of the afternoon in the way that 8-year-olds do when they love someone and are not embarrassed about it yet. We had food and stories, and the kind of noise that only a gathering of people who genuinely like each other can produce. And at some point in the early afternoon, Jason found me sitting in a chair slightly apart from the crowd watching everyone doing what I always did at gatherings, taking it in quietly from a small distance. He pulled up a chair beside me and sat down. We watched people for a while without speaking. Then he said, "Last year at this time I was in a meeting with Gerald Marsh talking about how to structure a sale you didn't know about." "I know," I said. "And you're sitting here next to me anyway," he said. "I am," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he asked. "I mean, why after everything? Why didn't you just cut your losses, restructure everything, write me off, find a way to be done with the whole disaster?" I thought about it. Not because I didn't know the answer, because the answer deserved to be said correctly. "Because you're my son," I said. "And because I know who you are underneath the mistakes. I've always known. I just spent too many years making it too easy for you to not be that person." I paused. "And because your mother would have never forgiven me for giving up on you. And I am not willing to go wherever she is and have that be the first thing she says to me." He was quiet. Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket and he handed me something. A photograph. Small, printed on regular paper, not professional. The kind of thing you print home because you need it to be real and tangible and you can't wait for anything fancier. It was the three of us. Me, Jason, and Margaret. He must have been 6 or 7. We were at a lake, not our cabin somewhere earlier than that, and Margaret was laughing at something off camera, and Jason was holding a fishing rod and looking up at me, and I was looking down at him, and I was smiling in the way you smile when you don't know anyone is taking a picture. The way you smile when you're just happy. I turned it over. On the back, in Jason's messy handwriting that Margaret always teased him about, he had written 4 words. "We'll figure it out." I held that photograph for a long time. I held it, and I thought about 32 years of burning buildings and covered debts and erased lines and Father's Day toasts and police reports and late-night phone calls and handwritten letters and a truck in my driveway on a June morning that belonged entirely and completely to my son. I thought about Margaret at 2 in the morning in a hospital parking lot. I thought about Emma asking if Grandpa was still her grandpa. I thought about Dennis shaking my hand and holding it a second too long. I thought about what it cost to hold a line when you love someone, and I thought about what it costs not to. Then I looked at my son sitting beside me in a folding chair on a warm June afternoon, watching his daughter try to drag Dennis Carver into a game of frisbee with the focused determination of a child who does not accept no as a final answer. And I said, yeah, we will. Not because everything was fixed. Not because the damage of 20 years could be undone in 12 months. But because the man sitting next to me was finally building something real. Something that had his name on it and no one else's. Something he had earned in the specific, unglamorous, irreplaceable way that things worth having are always earned. And because I was still there to see it. That is what I want you to take from this story. Not the Father's Day toast. Not the police report. Not even the forgiveness, though forgiveness matters, and I hope you never have to learn how much it costs. I want you to take this. The most important thing a parent can give a child is not money. It is not a safety net. It is not the guarantee that failure will never land. The most important thing you can give someone you love is the experience of finding out what they are made of when they have no choice but to find out. I spent 20 years protecting my son from that experience. It took one terrible Father's Day to make me stop. And it took another full year of hard, slow, unglamorous work by both of us to build something that neither failure nor inheritance could touch. Something that belonged to us. Not because of what I gave him, because of what we were finally at long last willing to tell each other the truth about. A father's love without courage is just a longer way of letting someone drown. And a son who finally swims on his own, that is worth every hard conversation, every held line, every sleepless night, every moment of sitting in a kitchen at 5 in the morning asking yourself where it all went wrong. That is worth everything.